Evening. A warm welcome to everyone present here. This webinar is hosted by Ellipsis. Ellipsis is a business innovation consulting company motivated to curating and sharing knowledge related to innovation in general and social innovation in particular. My name is Dilip, and I will be the host for this conversation on innovation during and after COVID crisis with Dr. Vishal Rao. It is a privilege for me to introduce Dr. Vishal Rao to all the guests present here. A quick Google search or whatever you might want to do with on Dr. Vishal Rao would tell you various things about Dr. Rao, be it delivering lectures on disruptive innovation at the Harvard Business School, or giving a TED talk on one of his amazing innovations, the Om prosthesis, that gives voice to the speechless, or the advisory positions that he holds with the central as well as the state government on various policies related to tobacco. But my own interaction with Dr. Rao for the last 2 years prompts me to talk about him on a rather personal level. What I see in Dr. Rao is a tireless individual, always inspiring, and highly innovative person.
Hello, Sharath.
So I would invite Dr. Rao to talk about the following topics. So the first thing is, Dr. Rao, your thoughts on the current project that you are involved as far as this COVID-19 is concerned. Would you be willing to share your thoughts on what exactly are you doing as far as this project is concerned?
Thank you, Dilip. You've been too generous in your introduction to me. When we were discussing yesterday, at midnight, wondering what are we going to be discussing about, and we actually thought of a couple of points, and I think that was very interesting on what is it that we can actually discuss about this. I'm remembered of some very beautiful words by Winston Churchill. When he described in 1938 October about the Second World War and about the position with Russia, he said something very beautiful. He said it's a riddle wrapped in a mystery within an enigma, and that is what classically describes our current state. So what are we doing about it? I think nothing much, but yet we are trying hard. I think that's truly what it has brought us down to. We seem as helpless, yet we seem to do our best. So a lot of learnings for me during this particular period, because I think from where I looked at it, everybody has gone wrong. Every expert in this globe has gone wrong, whether it is the WHO, whether it is the world's most advanced nations, whether it is the most simplest nations, to the global institutions. I think I don't see anybody who has got it right.
No, I mean the project that you are involved in as far as a treatment for COVID is concerned.
Yeah.
If you could please throw some light on that.
So this is a very interesting one. So I'll tell you where it started. It started on a very funny note. It started March 12th. I was supposed to be in London. And Mr. Michael Bloomberg was hosting a meeting of the Partnership for Healthy Cities. He's the UN ambassador for the world, and he was hosting this very interesting meeting in London, co-hosting it with Dr. Tedros and with Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London. This meeting was scheduled on the March 12th, and we were all supposed to be there. I was one of the speakers. And 10 days before, my wife asked me, "Are you sure this meeting is on?" because of this current COVID thing. But then I got a correspondence from their office saying that the meeting was still on and we should all come as an inspiration because this is a WHO UN meeting. So I was all set saying, no, I should go there. And by that time, we had not even a whiff of this information of what we are into. A few days later, that's at least about 5-6 days later, we get a correspondence saying that the health minister was affected and hence they had to postpone this meeting. So that was the first indication to us that it doesn't allow anybody. The signature of this virus was that it doesn't spare anybody. It doesn't look at socioeconomic strata, borders. So I called it the World War C then, you know. So that was the beginning of the entire episode for us to say, how is this pandemic going to span out? What are we going to see through this entire thing? So a lot of learnings through this thing. But the first thing that I got a glimpse of, because I was start time talking to all the global experts around this meeting, we were getting ready. We were actually getting ready for non-communicable diseases, you know. So as an oncologist, I was actually sitting to go there to talk on non-communicable diseases, and look at the paradox. They asked us, why is an oncologist playing such an important role in this virus? So, you know, on a lighter note, I keep telling them, first of all, that virology and oncology are close friends because viruses cause cancer. So we study them a lot. Secondly, this particular thing is something where non-domain experts can contribute more than domain experts. You know, today I have a team of 12 members. I have virologists, I have intensivists, I have hematologists, I have blood bank experts, I have physicians, pulmonologists. Yet everybody seems to be enigmatic about this. This virus has made a joke out of us that 90% of the people don't require treatment, and of the 5%, whatever you do, you may not be able to achieve much. And the rest of them in between just need oxygen. Yet we are all seeming to go crazy about this entire episode. So there are three things about this virus which I believe are signature. Number one is, we cannot underestimate this virus, because the last time, that is when the Spanish flu 100 years back, when it hit us, it killed about 2 crore Indians. And it had a crude fatality rate of about 2.2%. The Spanish flu is that was the Spanish flu, when the social norms were half of what it is right now. So currently, the crude fatality rate of the coronavirus is at about 3.75. So we naturally better take it seriously. Second thing,
Yes.
about this is, there is no vaccine or treatment currently available, which is what is creating the panic among people.
True.
The third aspect is that there is a fear of looming death. We don't know who is going to die. They say it's about 3 to 5%, but the question is, who is that 3 to 5%? Is it
True.
going to be me? And that's the kind of thing that it will unfold after it enters your body, which is the worst kind of thing that you're going to be experiencing, that uncertainty of death looming on your head. And lastly, for those people who are a little more on the front line and who are running the economy, it's the worry about saying that I'll have to be sitting at home without doing anything for 3 weeks.
True.
Just sitting, me and my virus, nothing else, you know. So there are several things about this particular enigma that actually keep us pondering. So when I started this entire episode, you know, there was a lot of directions that Government of India gave us, and it was a very strange discussion. I was with my immunology team sitting in my office. So I want to acknowledge Dr. Gururaj Rao and Dr. Jyotsna. Dr. Jyotsna is she was an earlier research associate with Dr. Ralph Steinman, the man who discovered the immune system and got a Nobel Prize for it. She was at Rockefeller, and Gururaj he's at Chapel Hill. So we were doing a lot of work on cancer vaccine, and we were sitting in that second week of March, just on a lighter note, discussing on the coronavirus. And Jyotsna came up and said, I think we should do something about this from our side. And, all three of us looked at each other and said, I think we have the capabilities, we should be doing this, you know. So it was a spontaneous decision that we all agreed upon, saying that, look, if this is going to hit a pandemic point, why don't we do something about it? So the first step that we took was actually working on, can we build the immune system and reactivate it to kill the virus? Because we knew that this virus, in 90% of them, your own immune system can recognize it. In those 5 to 10% where it cannot, why is it not doing it, is what we understood. So we understood that there is a very interesting organ called the thymus gland, which is not able to recognize these viruses, and hence these people are able to get into a critical stage and eventually to death because of this. So we did put our research teams together. We actually started working on it at that time, and parallelly started working on plasma therapy and mesenchymal stem cell therapy for critical illnesses. So if you ask me about the spectrum of diseases, what we did was we started working, number one is on the mild to moderate cases, which is going to be treated with the cytokine therapy that we had invented, which is called the ICREST protocol. For the moderate diseases, we had built up the plasma therapy. And for the terminally ill people who are having this acute respiratory kind of problems, we had built the mesenchymal stem cell protocol. So all three of it, we started parallelly working on. So that's how the journey began. So we started working on that. And through the entire journey, we actually started more collaborations, because when we started working with another team on looking at improving better RNA extractions, which we are currently doing, we are also looking at parallelly coming up with non-invasive clinical tests which are going to be simplifying PCR. So we have our team of scientists have been working on a DNA enzyme test, isothermal test, and a couple of other specific interesting tests which are going to simplify RNA extraction to doing a simple colorimetric test where you spit and the color changes to green and says COVID positive, rather than investing 50 lakhs into that machine, which is going to be a cumbersome task.
Dr. Rao, sorry if I may just,
please.
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing from the point of view of, innovation that really, prompts me to ask this question is something that you said very interestingly, that the three of you were sitting and talking about, things very on a lighter note, and you wanted to do something about it. So, I would like you to, tell us a little more about, the importance of corporate innovation, focusing more on social good rather than profit maximization. Because, I mean, now you talked about an informal team coming together and, really systematically trying to do something. These are things that corporate, largely we do not see systematically, approaching these kind of innovations. So what can corporates do to actually focus on innovating, not necessarily for profit maximization, but for social good?
So, Dilip, I think this is something that is very crucial today, because the corporations of the future will be defined not on wealth creation but on value creation. And this is going to be a defining thing. So today, if you see, Corona has somewhere brought to light a lot of changes. And I'm saying this is something that was around the corner, but has been brought to the forefront now. And what's going to be very, very crucial as a determinant in the next coming years is going to be largely on the principles of reverse mentoring. Okay. And I'm going to talk a little more in detail about it later, maybe when we discuss this. But what's crucial for the question you asked was, how can, I always told this as a larger principle. So somebody, I was giving this medical lecture once to a group of students, medical students. One of them asked me a very nice question. He walked to me, this young second year medical student walks to me and says, sir, can you tell me how do I get a brilliant idea? And I smiled and I said, I like the question. I said, look, hold on to one patient's problem through your life and you'll be flooded with brilliant ideas. I told him, look, hold on to an individual's problem. Don't hold on to markets. The problem is, a lot of the time, somewhere in the corporate philosophy, we are taught is to search for markets.
True.
I always say that individual problems have a soul to them. Okay. So these individual problems which have a soul to them, when you start connecting with them, then you can take them to the masses and that can become markets. But if you're going to take it to the markets first and start solving it, it becomes the reverse way. And that defeats the purpose of innovations, because you have no purpose to these innovations. You have no purpose to these innovations.
Or at least we do not have economic purpose to innovation.
And it should be there. I feel economic purpose. See, I always believed in this, that you follow Saraswati, Lakshmi may follow.
True.
If you just chase Lakshmi, you cannot guarantee Saraswati will join you.
True.
In a lighter note. So, in the Indian mythological thoughts, also has been one of the very entrenched principles that the answer appears when the question is ready.
That's true.
So I think defining the questions is core, and in defining the question, adding a social dimension is powerful. It adds a soul to the whole problem.
So, I mean, there's one more thing that you mentioned which kind of intrigues me. I kind of study how companies innovate for my research. And one thing that you mentioned was getting non-domain experts come and contribute to this innovation. How would that actually help? Because one of the things that we kind of, intuitively or conventionally we understand is if something has to be innovated, somebody who's deep into that will be able to think about it. So you're actually, what you say is highly counterintuitive. So how can non-domain experts actually contribute to innovation? And is that the way corporates should look at innovation in future?
Yeah, so this is something I learned through one of my leadership talks. I was giving this very interesting talk on 20 minutes to disruption, and this was a talk during which I was intended to confuse the audience with my philosophies, And through the session, I was talking on a couple of points, and at the end of the session, the Rolls-Royce executive officer walked to me. Lee walked to me and said he introduced himself and said, I had the Rolls-Royce practices, and he was talking about innovation, and he told me, he said we should connect on some of these works together and do something. And we had a very interesting conversation in which he told me two beautiful things. He said we have a slot called the non-domain expert. He said and he gave me a very interesting perspective that 20th century knowledge was power, and in 21st century ignorance is power.
Yeah,
Because education has partly put in a lot of efforts to ruin our thinking, and that has led for us to kind of block our thinking. So but this was a perspective that they were sharing, that sometimes when you want to look at a new car design, you might not go to an engineer, you can go to school children and actually look at how do the children look at designs of this. And that's I think the true design thinking of non-domains. So I believe non-domain is going to be an essential commodity for every single specialty in the coming years.
that is extremely interesting. I mean, knowing more and more about less and less has always been incentivized by both educators as well as industry. Now you are saying you have to bring in people who really do not know much about this to be able to see things differently. I think that's a really really interesting thought. And you also in the beginning mentioned how people who were working on different things in different domains came together and wanted to work on this particular this coronavirus. So that brings me to my next question, which is how can institutions create a conducive environment so that these kind of innovations can be explored and practiced? Perhaps this is a good time for you to tell us more about your reverse mentoring, Doctor.
Yeah, and I think what's also crucial for us to look at this particular juncture is how are we going to encourage innovations and the ecosystems. It's very interesting that one of the things that I learned during this entire corona phase, which I've been discussing with our teams, is about the importance of reverse mentoring. And this was a concept which one of our team members, Dr. Keewings Dwani, actually mooted, and we actually thought we'll actually create a complete stream of talks around this, on what is it that the younger can teach the elders, what is it that the student can teach the professor, what is it that the poor can teach the rich, what is it that corporations can be learning from startups. There's a whole lot of lessons we are missing. And I think reverse mentoring is the need of the hour. And building ecosystems which are based on speed. So I always use in healthcare a classic example of the Formula One. And I say if a Formula One can be achieved in 1.08 seconds, a pit stop, I mean, we ought to save a life at least at the same pace, if not faster. I mean, that's the need of the hour, to look at fast tracking innovations. How do we create such an ecosystem which is connected, which is powered by IoT, where there's going to be Internet of Things crossing and connecting each other into domains, and encourage. So we've created a forum of design health thinking, where we actually bring this ecosystem together for design health thinking, where we have complete non-domains to domains to expertises across domains coming together, exchanging thought-provoking revolutionary changes and questioning status quos. That I think is something that institutions have to be encouraged for. The classic example for that was the Rajiv Gandhi University of Health Sciences, the largest healthcare university of the country. I'm a member of their board of studies. 25th of May, our vice chancellor was having this thing about we need to do something for the Silver Jubilee celebrations. And, we were mooting this idea to him, saying, so why don't we have like a hackathon? And this was an unusual thought, correct? A medical university hosting a hackathon.
Yeah.
But he actually encouraged the whole thing and said, yes, I think we should pull this off, but do you really think this is going to happen? 5 days left, and we wanted to do it on June 1st. And we said, you know what, I think we should, this is the real Formula One style. I said, let's do it. So we actually put this together, and we had 1,200 odd applications, and 200 of them which were brilliant. So it actually built team spirit, it brought people together, and that's the kind of thing that we want. And the listening to the ideas, I must tell you, Dilip, it was fascinating. It was a heartwarming experience. I saw first year students sitting next to the dissection table, pitching ideas to us, telling their business models, telling their plans, telling about how they believe this is the game changer. And I said, look, when I was in my first year, I dare dream of this. Today, that has already started to happen.
Yes.
And the pivotal thing for me in this is leadership. Leadership is the pivotal thing. And I think more and more of such programs need to be initiated, where we actually encourage leadership in our programs, where we talk about leadership. And Corona is one classic example that taught me the biggest lesson of leadership. It taught me that leaders need not always lead, they can follow also.
That's a
lesson it taught me.
Yes, that's really nice. I mean, so I'm given to understand that we have 100 plus participants from Kazakhstan to US to Australia. So thank you all of you for joining us. One of the questions that that is ringing in their mind is also something that I wanted to ask you. If we look at media worldwide today, it is full of opinions, it's full of propaganda, it's full of speculations. I really wanted you to tell us how big the problem is, whether this is a big problem or not, and most importantly, to tell us your views on whether this lockdown is really a solution.
Correct. So I think there's been a lot of myths and lot of truths. Like I told you, the quotation number one, it's a riddle wrapped in a mystery within an enigma. So whatever you say can be partially right but partially false. And now the media decides on which side to focus on. Now, in this whole process, the question is, I think there are a lot of learnings from the myths that we are learning from currently. The first question you said was lockdown. Does this help? Now, if you see, I've always said this very simple thing, that lockdowns are a way to prepare. They are not a solution by itself. Now, why am I saying this? For two reasons. When you do lockdowns, one of the intentions of governments world over was that you are trying to reduce the social interaction, because this virus is a very social virus. True. This is a very phenomenally social virus. So you have to slow down your social interaction. And that's why you do a lockdown. And in the process, as you slow, it's like a speed breaker that you're putting on social interaction. And while you're slowing down, you need to slow the virus, and you need to build a China wall between the positive and the negative. And that's True. The only trick that you have. You need to build the China wall between the positive corona patients and the negative corona patients, so that you can safeguard the society and run the economy. Now, I've been saying this, that there are only two options for governments to take. There are two wrong options. There's no right option. One option is sacrifice your health. Another option is sacrifice economy. Now, 98% of the world's countries mostly have fallen into this bracket of taking the wrong decision of either health or economy. Very few countries took it right. Now, what's the secret behind these people who took it right?
I mean, I'm sorry. What is right then? Because you're really telling us something which is very difficult of two wrongs: sacrifice the economy or sacrifice the public health. Sacrificing either of this is wrong. So, what really would be the right thing to do?
Some of these countries have got it right. I'm talking about majority. I'm talking about not statistical outliers. I'm talking about most countries that have got it wrong. Now, the countries that got it right, Dilip, the countries that have got it, like I'm saying, not fully right, but at least partially right. South Korea, Germany, countries such as New Zealand, Australia, there are countries that have got it partially right. What did they follow? The one thing that I must tell you is these countries have a pandemic protocol. These countries have a possibly an emergency minister or a public health minister. They've got a leadership position in this particular area, which already was anticipating it. So I give this classic example that if I know karate and if you attack me, I'm going to do this karate move and defend myself from you. But if I don't know karate and Dilip is standing in front of me to attack me, And if I tell Dilip, just hold on, I'm watching a YouTube video and I'm going to do a move now in 2 minutes, I'm going to fail, Dilip. That's what we did. We actually did this. Huh?
Absolutely.
We actually did this whole thing wrong because we don't have a pandemic protocol. We don't have a disaster management drill. We should have been geared for such drills. When time and again global experts, Bill Gates did a TED talk in 2015 telling us, as though he kind of saw like a bhavishyavani of this whole thing, telling exactly pen to pen to say, line to line, say this is going to happen. Movies were created on this. On imagination? No, I think they were based on some kind of extended imagination
Hunch,
in facts.
possibly.
So I think the greatest lesson was that we did not have a disaster management drill. That's why we got it wrong. And that's why it leads us. If you don't have a disaster management drill, then yes, you got two wrong options. You sacrifice health or you sacrifice economy. And both of the times you're going to be wrong.
If I kind of put it together, what you are saying is, since we did not have the required preparedness, it became as though we are watching a YouTube video to learn karate when the person is already standing in front of us to actually attack us. One of the questions that comes from the audience is, you have to forgive me if I don't pronounce it properly in medical terms. With advanced image, times become atrophied. Then is adults' immunity higher than children? If that's the question. How does our lifestyle affect immunity, and what can we do about it?
So immunity is like an absentee landlord. We really don't know how to spot this guy. Okay. But we all talk about him. We all talk about this guy called immunity and say, we all want good immunity. But the question is a brilliant one. So I'll tell you, this is a paper I published and I'll share that full text with you so that you can share it with these people. So one of the first quandaries we had in this was the same thing, that children who have an immature immune system seem to be very, very strong and immune against the virus.
Okay.
Whereas elderly who have a very mature immune system, who have seen the whole life and say, I have 30 years experience, are succumbing to this illness. So what is going wrong in this? And that's one of the first reverse mentoring lessons we learned, that this virus seems to be targeting elderly people more than younger people, where the elderly people seem to have a more mature immune system. So one of the first things that we found, which is very interesting and again published in one of the international journals by LGVS, is that we found that it is the thymus gland which gets degenerated after the age of 65 plus.
Okay.
Now the thymus gland is actually develops inside the mother's womb. So now what does this thymus gland do? The thymus gland is like a pen drive. It's like a flash drive that actually maintains the memory of the enemy. So which means whenever there is an attack, the first thing is, in the first 3 to 4 days, your immune system, whichever is circulating, is active and tries to kill the virus. Okay. So how does the immune system kill the virus? So there are certain cells in the immune cells, like the T cells, the lymphocytes. What they do is they secrete certain interferons. They're called interferons or cytokines because these interferons interfere with the virus.
Okay.
So what do? When a cell gets infected with this virus, the cell immediately secretes these proteins called interferons, which are called signaling proteins. They go in and around and start, like beat police, start doing this loud sound and tell the neighbors to say, look, this virus is coming, get ready. So what do the surrounding cells do? They start preparing special proteins that can kill this virus. Okay. Now, that is the job of the first few days. If you see people who are dying, they're dying from the 8th day to the 37th day. Why do they die this late? Because by the time that the first round of cells are exhausted, the soldiers are lost, then it contacts the thymus to say, can you please release some more? We need more soldiers. Now the thymus, if it is degenerated, which is what happens 65 plus, the thymus says, look, I'm tired, I'm not able to recognize these viruses, sorry, I can't send more people. That's when the problem begins. And people start to die. But if your immune system is active, which means your thymus is active and it is able to pick up the memory of the thing, that is what is happening in 80% of the people. They are just coming out of it in no time.
True.
10 days on their own, they're coming out. That's because of the thymus.
Connected.
I hope it answers the question there.
Yeah, yes. Connected to this, there is another interesting question from the audience. I don't know how you will take it, but nevertheless, it is my duty to ask this question. It says in Chennai, more than 500 patients are believed to be cured by Siddha medicine. So, you have any views on this? I know that you are an open person, and we have had this conversation before. So, is there any systematic scientific way of looking at this?
So today I met with an interesting group. I in fact met with one. We've been collectively working with a group of Ayurvedic experts, and this is spearheaded by an allopathic expert who's joined hands with Ayurvedic experts to actually build this entire thing. And I've been a part of this team. They found 20 of the new herbs that have been showing antiviral activities, which they have used studying docking technology, which means they're using protein structural studies. They've actually found that these herbs can kill the virus. Using that, we built a concoction, which actually is a herbal extract that can actually kill the virus and is showing some very, very interesting initial promising results. I am trying to tell you that yes, there are several such potentials that may exist. Maybe the Siddha person is already working on 4 such. We don't know. What happens is today the benchmark of science is allopathy. Not because we accept this, but it has evolved as a science that questions and that asks for proof and then provides proof.
No, sorry to interrupt there. But does that also mean an over dependency on empiricism? And is it like saying only if something is empirically proved, that only then I will be able to accept it or not? I mean, when you say scientific proof, empiricism need not necessarily be the only way of scientific proof, right?
Agree. And which is where we need to draw a line, but that is where there has to be some benchmark that we need to follow, because the one thing in medicine as compared to any other areas of business is it can also harm, and the Hippocratic oath tells us is above all do no harm. So the fear is that in this bargain you will see everybody coming forward and telling I have a magic solution. If you see my health minister telling about his briefing, he gets us a pile of his mails and shows it and says 30 at least among them have found a solution, which is completely eradicating. Now, how do you actually screen this? And that is where I think the biggest thing about healthcare is while the intellectual property is important, the regulatory is equally difficult because it can harm.
True. Yeah, I mean, so this actually brings me back to another interesting thought. I mean, I study design thinking. So when you spoke about non-domain experts, kind of expanding this, is the way forward cross-disciplinary innovation? I mean, it's, or maybe transdisciplinary. Have we come to a stage where it has become necessary for us to completely go out of our, not just domain, but out of the discipline as such, and look for inputs from different things? And do you think this would actually help us understand the complexity of tomorrow in a much better way?
No, I completely agree with this. So I'll tell you a personal experience of mine, which actually I connect with this. So I believe in the principle of what's called the Occam's razor. I don't know if you have heard about this. So Occam's razor is a very interesting principle which says that when you're faced with a very intriguing problem, complex, find a simple solution. Don't complicate the solution also. And the principle of this lies from non-domain to cross domains, because sometimes it's about a perspective that you can get. It's about a perspective. And for me, one of the biggest learnings that I had was when I was working on my voice box prosthesis. I had failed to develop the inserters. 6 months I was actually not able to do it. I'd failed and I was not moving forward. It was one of those days when I'd actually given up, and yet thought that I should keep persisting. That it was there in the back of my head to say that I need to do something about it. That something very unfortunate happened that evening. My wife asked me to come out shopping with her. So we had a philosophical divide on shopping. So she goes to pick up what she wants, and I go to figure out what I want. So we were lost. So me and my son were supposed to accompany her, and we didn't have an option. So we both accompanied her. And we were at this health enclosed stores where this man was my young boy. He was that time 4. He was running amok in that place, throwing things around. And I walked towards him to stop him at one place where he was throwing a box down. I picked up that box. I looked at it. It was a box of tampons. And I suddenly found a eureka moment. I said, "This is it." I said, I found my inserter. This is the most simple inserter. It's not a medical device. It is yet stored over the counter here. And there was a Japanese company that was there doing this at I don't know, at just about few bucks, for this. I immediately called the Japanese team. I contacted them. I talked to them what materials they use, how did they do. I mean, this was very interesting, correct? And then I went back to my engineers and I showed them, look, I said, I want my inserters to be as simple as that of a tampon. And they all stared at me. I remember those few days was quite exciting because I had tampon boxes in my house, in my office. And the worst thing was when I I went to the billing counter in the health and glow store with 10 boxes of tampons and my wife staring at it and saying that, what's going wrong? And I said, look, I think this is R&D. And she said, this is ridiculous. So the next couple of days was R&D on tampons, and I did search for this. But the interesting part was when I showed it to an engineer, he looked at it and said, Vishal, this looks like a toy. What are you talking? He's saying, we can't be doing inserters like this. But then I took a cue from it and I said, let's look at a toy maker. Okay, maybe a toy maker can solve this problem. No, that was ridiculous, correct? But that happened because my engineer friend told me, don't think it's a toy. Don't think it's a toy. And I was like thinking to myself, why can't I think it's a toy? Because toys are simple, they're interesting, they're fascinating. So I reached out to Channapatna, one of the villages here in Karnataka where they do toys. And I found one gentleman in a hole in the wall called Kausar Pasha, who actually does science toys. So I showed him this design and he loved it. And he said, sir, I can do a processed inserter design for you in 2 hours. So I got my first prototype from this man and today I'm his partner. And I'm saying how important this is. Imagine the extremity to which collaborations can happen.
That's really mind blowing. The next question that I have for you, which is also a question that apparently some of our listeners also are putting up, is kind of we are almost we have about 5 minutes with us now. So I need to ask you this question: what should policymakers and publics do to ease the lives of healthcare professionals? And when we are looking at the larger aspect of this question, what would be your advice to the policymakers to make sure that we come out of this with less damage?
So the most important thing I must tell you, Dilip, is that this particular times has taught us the pandemic protocol, the leadership from behind. This is called the Wolfpack theory. Leaders need not lead from front. Leaders can lead from behind. Leaders can sometimes follow. And that is the most important thing. This entire war is a scientific war. It's a war driven by data. So it's not a political war. So one thing that the politicians, policymakers need to do is have somebody robust as your advisor who's a scientific expert, who can actually lead the show. One. Second thing is, I think this also calls for teamwork, a multidisciplinary teamwork, because what we have found during this time is many places you have seen today that we've seen socialism, we've seen capitalism, we've seen communalism, we've seen corruptionism. We've not seen fully humanism still emerge. This is very crucial for us, that we cannot make it look like Corona we cannot make it look like humanity is the virus and Corona is the vaccine. And that is what at several places we have shown today, if you look at the depths of it. So what we will need to do is we'll need to bring about leadership in which we are going to save this world. And I think for countries that are taking it seriously, it's very important to say, don't open the lockdown until you have 0 cases. That is ideally desirable. And you open a lockdown when you have no new cases for 2 weeks. And thereon, you open up borders with other states or countries that have no new cases for 2 weeks. I mean, that's easier said and done, but that's ideal. That's ideal. That's achievable. That's ideal if you work hard on that.
Which actually means that you are hinting towards doing that part of wrong decision of giving more importance to health than the economy.
Than the economy, when it is controllable, when it's at a controllable point. When it explodes, you can't do this. At the very initial phases, this is the right time to do it. This is the ideal time to control these numbers and say we'll stop it, but we will. And that's what many of these countries did. That they actually did this thing by controlling those numbers. And I think that's crucial. So that's one aspect of it. I know it's easier said than done, but the point is that the way healthcare, this is not a war to be won in the hospital. This is a war to be won at home. We cannot be winning this war in the hospital. And I keep telling this, that healthcare workers cannot be overburdened with this entire problem, because you're going to fail. The biggest thing that you're going to have is you're going to have exhaustion. You're going to have, so there are three important things that I would like to put forward before you. This particular scenario is going to leave us with a psychological impact, a behavioral impact, and an economic impact. The psychological impact is going to be depressions, anxieties, worries, because it's going to take you to the edge of your seat. Behaviorally, it's going to make you more socially distant and cut you off from more people. And that's going to further impact the psychological part of it. And economically, we know that the last few months where the salary cuts, these months are job cuts, and the next few months you may see pockets getting cut. So crimes will going to increase. So we will need to be productive at the time of Corona. We will need to re-innovate the entire strategies, and this needs radical thinking. And I think we should encourage youngsters who are listening to this today to come up with the most radical solutions. Come on, write to Dilip and say, what is the most radical solution you have thought of to solve this thing? And that is the most important thing that we will need to think, because the generation next we'll have to create a new world which is going to be looking beyond this, which is going to be looking at priorities, which is going to be looking at productivity but value based, which is not going to get obsessed with economy. So Justice M.N. Venkatachalaya, the former Chief Justice of India, he's been a mentor. He told me something very beautiful. He said the progress of any country should be looked beyond the limited milestones of GDP alone. Because to run GDP, you can give this in the hands of smugglers or pirates. They'll run it better than any politician. A country should be envisaged by its progress on the benchmarks of expansion of freedom. And that's crucial. So he told me a very beautiful example. He said, Vishal, if 3 doctors every day go from the house to the hospital walking, the GDP is low. If these 3 doctors buy a nice fancy car and then drive it to the hospital, the GDP is much better. And if all the 3 doctors on the way to the hospital die in the accident, the GDP is the best. So GDP is a very limited way to assess progress. And that, I think, epitomizes the current scenario we are looking at, where we are desperate. We need to understand, yes, GDP is important, but today we are at a question of how are we going to remain productive, for which we'll need to innovate, and yet offset the psychological, behavioral, and economic sides of it, and emerge victorious. That's the challenge which Dilip, you will have to give to us now as the business management schools.
Thank you very much for this brilliant conversation, Dr. Rao. Just like every time we meet up, I think this has been one of the most interesting and fulfilling, conversations. So I am sure audience have a lot of questions. And I would encourage all of you to write to Ellipsis if you have any questions, and I'll make sure that it is passed on to Dr. Rao. And if he has some responses, it will be shared with you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dilip. All the easy questions will be answered by me, and the difficult sent to you.
I'm okay. Thank you, doctor.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.